you. is an American journalist, author, but most importantly to us, an educator. He would join us in the spring every year. He was Troy's Buchanan Chair of Journalism. I was hearing myself in stereo. It was awesome. We also are live streaming the event, so people around the world, I guess, who were touched by Stan can take a listen in on what we talk about. This year is extra special because we have an author of a book about Stan Evans who's with us to be the keynote speaker, Steve Hayward. So he'll be up in just a minute, but just to tell you a little bit about Stan and his time here, and I'm not going to get too much into it because you're going to hear all about it from the author himself, but he cared about our students a lot. And so this is one of the ways that we can honor that. He worked heavily with the business department of the school, talking about free market, and he was probably the smartest man that I have ever met. So I'm excited that you guys are going to get to learn a little bit more about him through reading a copy of the book. All of you will get a free copy of the book when you leave here. Please pick one up, and then the author will be here to sign the copy for you as well. So let me tell you a little bit about Stephen Hayward. He's going to come up and share about his book, but he is an American conservative author, political commentator, and policy scholar, currently a senior resident scholar at the Institute of Governmental Studies at UC Berkeley. He has written on a wide range of current topics: environmentalism, law, economics, public policy for publications, including the National Review, Reason, the Weekly Standard, the American Spectator, the Public Interest, the Claremont Review of Books, and Policy Review. His newspaper articles have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Chicago Trib, and dozens of others. He is also a book author. He has written The Index of Leading Environmental Indicators, published in 14 editions, a 2-volume narrative history of Ronald Reagan and his effect on American political life, and now M. Stanton Evans, conservative wit and apostle of freedom. So you guys, he's going to talk for a little while, and then this is all about you and your experience. So instead of coming up and asking questions and passing around a microphone, what we'd like you to do is tweet your questions for Mr. Hayward and our panelists later on. And on the back of your program that you picked up, you can see tweet questions to our panelists at Troy HSJC using hashtag MySHJC. And you have to have a public Twitter account because we can't see it if you have a private account. Just so you know who's coming up, and we'll do a bigger introduction for these folks later. We'll have John Merlin, a senior writer for donor communications for the Heritage Foundation. Darlene Hutchison-Bale, who was the former director, Office for Victims of Crime in D.C., Andrew Alabastro, Director of Coalition Relations for the Heritage Foundation, and then Tom Davis, Executive Assistant for the Chancellor's Office. And what do these folks have in common? They were all students of Stan, so you'll get to know him in a different way. So Steve, please come on up and take it away.
Thanks very much. Let me move my swag bag here out of the way to get started. Well, this is really a thrill. You know, I haven't even been here 24 hours yet, and I can see already why Stan loved to come here. One of the things I noticed on the way into town was a Popeye's fried chicken and Chick-fil-A on the same block. Now, that's the kind of thing that Stan would have said offered variety in your diet. One of the things I share with Stan, I like to think I share many things, but one of the things I share with him is a approval of fast food. And I've been saying for a while now that we won't really know that COVID is over until we get all-day breakfast back at McDonald's. That, to my mind, is the greatest casualty of COVID. The other thing is that Troy reminds me a bit of something Stan once said about Indiana when he moved there as a young man. And I actually heard him say something like this in the presence of Senator Sessions when Mr. Sessions was in the Senate. He used to say, "I'm from Texas. Texas and Alabama have some things in common. Most famously, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms is not a government bureau. It's a way of life," or his lifestyle, right? But he said something about Indiana when he first got there as the youngest editor of a major metropolitan daily in, I think, American history. He was 26 years old when he became editor of the Indianapolis News. something of an overachiever. So he moved to Indianapolis, and Time magazine did a story about this because they thought it was so remarkable that this chain of papers is owned by the Pulliam family back in the old days when we had press moguls, which have really disappeared except for maybe Rupert Murdoch, I suppose. And what he told Time magazine was the following: I think my philosophy is pretty close to the farmer in Seymour, Indiana. He believes in God. He believes in the United States. He believes in himself. The intuitive position is much closer to wisdom than the tortured theorems of some of our Harvard dons. Now this was, as you, if you don't know, you'll learn quickly from the book, this is from a Yale man. Although, there's the old joke about how can you figure out if someone's from Harvard? You don't need to, they'll tell you, right? Stan never talked about being a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Yale. In fact, if you asked him where he went to school, he'd usually say, oh, I went to Mr. Smith's correspondence school in New Jersey or something, right? And this was, he guarded like a state secret that he was a prominent Yale alum. So, as was mentioned, among other books I've written was a 2-volume political chronicle of Ronald Reagan. It kind of grew out of control. It meant to be 1 volume. It became 2, much to the consternation of my publisher. In any case, that was fun, but writing about Stan, writing a complete biography, has been an honor. I like to think of him as, and he was my first mentor out of college. I used to say, I think Stan would have approved of this line, that he was a practitioner of what I call Yogi Berra epistemology. If you know the old famous baseball player, famous for malapropisms, and one of them was, you can observe a lot just by watching. And a lot of what you picked up from Stan was not just his direct instruction, I'll talk about that in a little bit, but also just watching how he went about his craft. And because he was remarkably available to people. You could always walk into his office with a question. Sometimes he might be on deadline and say, please come back in 15 minutes or something, but otherwise he was always available to you, always willing to talk, give you advice, and tell you what he was doing and explaining it to you. And you picked up a lot doing that. Now, Stan liked to say that he, and this was no secret, that he was a conservative journalist, which he would immediately admit is perhaps an oxymoron, like jumbo shrimp or his favorite Senate Ethics Committee. That was one of them, right? But the truth is that what Stan cared about most, both at the National Journalism Center, where that's where I met him as an intern right out of college, but then also I'm utterly convinced just from knowing Stan and also talking to some people here on the faculty and former students that I've gotten to know, that he had the same central point here, which was quality journalism isn't about ideology. It's about a commitment first to getting the facts straight. First of all, getting the facts. And second, it is worthwhile to have some understanding of how the world works, some command of principles. And then, I guess the third part, there's more than 3 parts really, being willing to break from the pack and be original, asking counterintuitive questions, asking the questions. His big complaint about journalism wasn't so much that it was liberal, the New York Times and so forth. It was that it was too much in the throes of groupthink. Everyone thought the same thing. All the stories were the same. And so one of my enduring lessons from him, and I'm sure he's taught this to those of you who had his classes here, is he would say, for example, one of the best examples, said, so if there's a congressional, if you're in Washington, if there's a congressional committee hearing on some topic that you're covering, health care or energy or it doesn't matter what, first of all, go to the hearing. Don't just watch it on C-SPAN if it's on C-SPAN, or call someone on the phone to ask what happened, or just read a committee transcript of the congressional record. Go to the hearing. And then he says, watch carefully, and normally what happens, the example he liked to use is health care, and Senator Ted Kennedy, that was always one of his central issues throughout his entire career. He might be having a hearing on some health care proposal. And at the end of the hearing, all reporters will rush up to Senator Kennedy and get a quote from him for their stories. Makes perfect sense, famous person, leader in this cause. Stan said, that's not what you should do. What you should do in the hearing is look for the person sitting behind Senator Kennedy, or the ranking member, but who's ever actively engaged in the hearing. Watch that person. That's the person who will be passing notes to Senator Kennedy whispering in Senator Kennedy's ear, suggesting what questions to ask or what documents to look at and follow up with. You go talk to that person, find out who that person is. That's the person who's really going to know what's going on behind the scenes. And that's the source that will give you a better story than the whole pack that's following and just all repeating in their stories the same quote from Senator Kennedy that will likely be very general in any case, right? That seems simple and like common sense, and yet how little practiced is that, right? The other one, of course, is that in his own journalism and to all of us who were his pupils, I'd like to say primary sources or original sources, but in his case it meant look for government reports, often ignored. In the old days, these days you could find everything on the internet. Stan always liked to remind us that when he was young, if you wanted to change the channel on the TV, you had to get up and walk over to the TV and turn a knob. Unlike today with remotes, right? Of course, there were only 3 channels to watch till we got, as Stan might have said, Atlanta Braves baseball in the 70s, and that changed everything with cable. Anyway, these days everything's on the internet, but in the old days we all had to go off to the Library of Congress or to a government agency library. Federal bureaucracies, even in their regional offices, used to have libraries with all their reports and documents, and it took a lot of time to do, but that's where you found stuff that would make your journalism better and different than other people. So what he cared about, and quite often Stan in his articles, though he was very conservative, would give a shout out to otherwise liberal reporters who he thought had done a good job with the story or had broken new ground. And in other cases, he'd be after liberal reporters who he thought did a terrible job or, were lazy. And anyway, now I think that I won't exactly say Stan had a separation of church and state between his ideology and his journalism. He was an opinion journalist, but always putting the facts first and picking stories that other people ignored. Another great example, he thought from very early on that we paid insufficient attention to the amount of technology transfers to the Soviet Union and also the bad reasons for it, and thought that we were subsidizing the Soviet Union when at the same time they're our mortal enemy. And so he would report a lot on the latest technology transfer schemes and subsidies and all the various Byzantine ways this went about and critique it. And nobody thought this was news except Stan. And then when Ronald Reagan became president, he clamped down on that. It was part of his grand strategy to pressure the Soviet Union ultimately to its end. I did want to have a subtitle for the book. M. Stanton Evans, I wanted to call it The Perfect Conservative, and so I think he comes as close as anybody did to deserving that title. The publisher thought better, and I think they're right. Publishers usually are about titles. Conservative wit, because those who knew him knew something you never picked up or seldom from his writing is how darn funny he was. And then Apostle of Freedom. The point is that he wasn't just a journalist of the first rank, but he was also a theorist of the first rank, although I think he might consider being called a theorist an insult. He'd mock complain about that designation. His book, The Theme is Freedom, is a book that shows great theoretical depth in understanding the story of human liberty, tracing it from Roman and biblical times, really. And he fills some gaps that are missing from the conventional accounts of really the American founding, from both conservative and liberal historians. He thought everybody was missing some things and had gotten some things wrong and overemphasized certain things, like the place of John Locke, which is central to almost all accounts of the American founding, both left and right. And he thought that was true, but not exhaustive. And The Theme is Freedom, I think, is some of the best statements that captures a broader canvas of that. Really extraordinarily remarkable. I'm convinced from that book and other work of Stan's that had he chosen a conventional academic career, he would have taken his place alongside Eric Vogelin in political philosophy or Milton Friedman in economics. He did do a year of graduate study with Ludwig von Mises at NYU before he committed fully to journalism as a young man. So he could have been one of the preeminent academics of our time as either a historian, economist, political scientist, or philosopher. I have no doubt about that. You may be familiar with, and if you haven't, you should read one of his late books, Blacklisted by History, which is I'll put it this way, a correction of the record about Joe McCarthy, who's been the subject of so much calumny over the decades since he arrived on the American scene. It was not a polemic. He went through very carefully specific controversies to show what was right and what was wrong about what the historians and journalists said about him. what evidence has been lost, what evidence was misconstrued. And the honest reviewers, and there were some, said any future historian or anyone writing about Joe McCarthy has to reckon with the body material that Stan put together in that book. So, journalist, historian, theorist. I say perfect conservative. He bridged the gap in practical terms between what you might call the old right of Robert Taft and names that are really forgotten today because they go back 80 years or more, and what was called for a long time in the 60s and 70s the new right, which is now looking very old in their contemporary terms. But nonetheless, Stan described it very succinctly as saying the old right had some different ideas, especially on foreign policy. It was more openly and directly isolationist. And then World War II and the Cold War came along, which was a huge challenge. And second, it tended to be somewhat apolitical. People like the very interesting and amusing Albert J. Nock just hated politics and always told people, don't get involved with politics, it's terrible. And Stan was among the people in the post-war generation who said, if we're going to advance conservative ideas, we need to get involved in the political world. Although never wholly. Around the time of Reagan's first landslide in 1980, Stan was warning people, it's great to win elections with a candidate we admire, but remember that what's really important are your ideas and your principles, and you shouldn't expect salvation from politicians. Stan's great friend William Rusher, I think, spoke for Stan when he said, politicians will always disappoint you. That's just the nature of real political life in a democracy. So if you put huge transformational and even sometimes salvific hopes in a politician, that's going to be bad for you, bad for your cause, but especially bad for you. So he was always cautioning people not to get carried away with practical politics, which I think is very good advice. He was a key political activist. I'm not sure if he ever talked about it much here. I suspect he didn't. And by the time he was teaching here in the 80s and 90s, he had kind of put behind him his direct activist phase in politics. So in the early 70s, he became chairman of the American Conservative Union. The organization's still around. It's a little different than it was then, but it was modeled specifically after what the liberals had done for decades, which was the Americans for Democratic Action, an old liberal group that had been around since the 30s or certainly the 40s. All the prominent liberals belonged to it, including in the late 40s a guy named Ronald Reagan, who was a dues-paying member. And Stan thought as early as 1958 or so, conservatives need to have something just like it. And so the American Conservative Union was born in the mid-60s, and Stan became the chairman of it in the early 70s and saw its most important growth and most important political impact. I don't know if any of you follow the CPAC, it's called, the Conservative Political Action Conference. It's a huge thing now with 8,000 people go. It's now in Orlando, Florida, I think last month, and it's kind of show business. You know, lights and everything. Stan started it. He started it in early 1975, a few months after Nixon had resigned in the Watergate disaster. And Stan thought, almost in these terms, conservatives need to throw a party because we're all depressed. This has just been bad for us, bad for the country. And he got outgoing California Governor Ronald Reagan to agree to be the headline speaker. Problem was, we didn't have a mailing list. Didn't have any people to come, didn't know how they were going to get people to come. And he was telling his staff, the language we used then, go and drag every wino off the street if you have to get a crowd. Ended up being a great success, several hundred people for the banquet that Governor Reagan spoke at. And then CPAC grew from there. He spoke for the last time, Stan did, at the CPAC meeting in 2013. Then it was being held in Baltimore. It had moved from Washington up to Baltimore. I'm not quite sure why, but a little bit bigger venue by the harbor, I guess. And coincidentally, that was the meeting where reality TV show host Donald Trump showed up and for the first time kind of declared his allegiance to the conservative movement after being everything under the sun before that, right? That's, you know, what the heck is this guy? And it was interesting to go back and look at Stan's talk. You can find it on C-SPAN, where he talked about immigration has become a big mess and we need to sort this out. He'd always been generally pro-immigration and still was up to the very last, but thought that it was chaotic and needed some serious rethinking how it was done. And of course that became, put in more cruder ways, of course, a central theme of candidate Trump, as we know. He was prescient in a number of ways. Here I'll share a few This shows a key point that everyone should have. It relates to journalism, but more broadly, his utterly independent mind. I'll mention a couple of issues where I'll say he broke from, not exactly broke, but he took a different view than what you might call conservative political orthodoxy. One of them was he never liked Richard Nixon going back to 1960. Although his famous joke about Nixon, I don't know how much of you've ever studied Watergate or the Nixon years, but his famous joke about Nixon was, I didn't support Nixon until after Watergate. And he was a huge critic of while Nixon was in office, thought he was too liberal, thought his foreign policy was too weak. He once said, one of the great illusions of our time is that Henry Kissinger knows what he's doing. And because Kissinger's still alive at age 100 or whatever he is now, Kissinger was thought to be this great genius, and Stan had a couple of face-to-face meetings with him that were very blunt, polite but blunt. And Stan later said to a couple of people that I met Henry Kissinger 3 times in my life, and he lied to me all 3 times. It's one of the few really blunt things Stan ever said about a fellow human being. That was not his style. But he didn't like Nixon, and most conservatives did. This also will probably maybe sound puzzling if you don't know the history. So Barry Goldwater, the breakthrough candidate for conservatives and winning the Republican nomination in 1964 and then losing 45 states. Stan liked to joke in later years, we young conservatives had to get over the Goldwater defeat without grief counselors. And believe me, having been on the campus at UC Berkeley the day after the 2016 election, that is not an exaggeration, an ironic exaggeration. Anyway, in later years, conservatives started getting critical of Goldwater because he started moving to a more liberal direction on some specific issues, social issues and whatnot, and people say, what happened to our former hero? Stan would have none of that. He asked Senator Goldwater, still in the Senate, to renew his membership of the American Conservative Union Board. And Goldwater was very close to Stan and said, gosh, should I do it? I know a lot of conservatives are mad at me. And Stan said, I don't care. Your good deeds from back in the 60s will stand with me forever, which I thought was interesting on his part. And then on the issues, so health care, he was always against, I guess we'd say, socialized medicine or complete government centralization of health care. So he understood very early on with the arrival of Medicare and Medicaid in 1965 that the entrance of the federal government in health care from really 0 to 100 miles an hour in 2 seconds would end up distorting the entire market for health care. And of course he was right about this. I once looked up the figures. By 1980, just 15 years into the program, Medicare, just Medicare, forget Medicaid, which is the state, it's also expensive, but a state responsibility mostly. Medicare, by 1980, cost 10 times more than the original projection for 15 years out at the time Medicare started. Not just a little bit more, 10 times more. And I shudder to even look now, and the projections out in the future are pretty grim. And so what he understood is that it won't just raise government spending, which always bothered him, but it will distort the entire healthcare marketplace, including the world of private insurance. So if you're like me and you're getting to that age where you consume more healthcare services, I'll put it that way, you get these statements from your insurance company and you can't understand them. They'll say, well, here's the bill, and here's what we pay, this is your obligation, and then it always says in big, this is not a bill, and then you get a bill. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Who can figure this out? It's insane. It's the only, and healthcare is 18% of our economy now, and it's the only sector of our economy where you can't get real prices. That's just utterly opaque to everyone. And that includes the private world of insurance, not just what the government does. Ironically, and I think Stan would admit this if you asked him today, the government part of it is actually somewhat more transparent and coherent than private insurance. And so what a mess we have. So he didn't like Hillary Care, as it was called. He didn't like Obamacare, as we called the Affordable Care Act. He liked to joke, we need to repeal Obamacare so we can find out what's not in it. There's that famous statement by then Speaker, and again today, Speaker Pelosi, saying, we have to pass it to find out what's in it. And Stan says, I still don't know what's in it after it passed, but I do know this. If we repeal it, whatever is in it won't be in it. That's right. That slow drawl, I can't do it the way as well as he did, but it was good stuff. But he did say, so we have a big problem. What the government has done is it has imposed rationing on the private sector through HMOs and through the way our insurance scheme works. So we used to say to conservatives in the 90s, yeah, we don't want to have a centralized bureaucracy like Hillary Care. We don't want to have price controls and the kind of rationing mechanisms that were embedded in Obamacare, but conservatives should not be averse to government oversight of the insurance market to protect consumers the old-fashioned way. It was not in consumer interest to have this crazy system that's wrecked the whole marketplace for health care. And a couple of times he said conservatives ought to support some democratic proposals for oversight of HMOs and private insurance. And that surprised a lot of conservatives whose basic default position was if the Democrats are proposing a regulation, the answer is no, right? Most of the time, probably a good, if you're conservative, a good premise, but here and there, you see, he would break from the orthodoxy because of the independence of his mind. He anticipated very early, by that I mean the early 1960s, what today is a commonplace phrase and concern that goes under the unwieldy phrase, the administrative state. The administrative state, sometimes people call it the deep state. That's the more popular form. They're not exactly the same, but close enough for popular use. And the administrative state is two things. One, it's a constitutional problem because it erodes the separation of powers. Congress, by degrees, going back to the New Deal and before, has delegated too much power to the executive branch to make the law. What is a regulation but a longer word for law, but not enacted by Congress? He thought that was a serious constitutional problem. But secondly, he thought it was for lack of a better term, a cognitive problem, because the premise was we need to have the administrative state because modern problems require specialized expertise. And on the surface, there's some sense to that. On the other hand, there's also a shortage of expertise. There's also the problem the public choice theorists worked out of the self-interest of bureaucracies, in which even, and in groupthink, right? All these experts, suddenly they all think the same thing. We're going to be studying the response to COVID for decades and reaching very different conclusions about it, I think. We're just getting started with that process because we're not quite done, right? I wish Stan were here to comment on this. I'm sure he'd have lots to say about it. So he thought as early as the 1960s, this is where the government is headed before some of the biggest changes that brought us to where we are now occurred, and why it was bad. Let me see if I can find one of these. Let's see here. I've got them marked out. Yeah. Here we go. This is from late 1960s, so a long time ago now, even for me. Confusion on this point, the point as to which branch of government is responsible for lawmaking, confusion on this point is closely tied to the idea of government as the preserve of experts, weighing technical issues in which the goals to be sought are already known, and debate is reduced to a question of how best to achieve them. In this conception, Congress is thought to be in need of expert counsel, and the executive bureaucracy, with its complement of experts, is seen as the superior instrument of policy. The founders' view was, of course, quite different. The truly important questions, again, are not technical, but political. Not how we do something, but what we are to do. Go on a long time about this because the literature that's going up about this is extensive. It's now a very live issue in our jurisprudence at the Supreme Court and elsewhere. And there was Stan, 40 years ahead of time, raising a flag on this problem. One of the things that surprised me in doing my research is I had never read his journalism from back in the early 1960s at the Indianapolis News, and it was quite remarkable. And the one part that was most remarkable were his foreign policy views. Stan was, of course, a strong anti-communist and Cold Warrior, but with a big asterisk. He thought we were making a big mistake in overestimating the capacities of the Soviet Union, their technical capacities, their political appeal to the developing world, as we called it then. And he thought that our foreign policy establishment was making a great mistake in crediting all of the boasts. The Soviet Union used to claim everything from, having the best rocketry, the best aviation. They even claimed once to have invented baseball, just to annoy us, I think. And, our CIA and our media would sort of accept this, say, oh my goodness. And what Stan thought was, ironically, this is going to make it less likely that the United States and its allies will stand up as forcefully as they should to the Soviet Union and their expansionist ideals. So if you know your history, for example, of the 1960 presidential campaign, John Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, tried to run to the right of Richard Nixon on the Cold War by claiming there's a missile gap. The Soviet Union is ahead of us in ballistic missiles and nuclear technology. It wasn't true, as we learned later. It was a campaign tactic. Stan immediately thought it wasn't true at the instant it started in 1959 and 1960. He says, this can't be right. And so he did say, there's a sentence he wrote in one of his columns, there's no necessary connection between large defense spending and a coherent and vigorous Cold War strategy. That's normally the kind of a sentence by itself you would associate with a leftist writer like I.F. Stone. He was one of the most famous proponents of Cold War overreaction on the left back in those years, or Gabriel Kolko was another one. Now, Stan always supported stronger defense spending and missile defense and other things, but his insight there was, if we get the nature of the threat wrong, which he thought we were doing, we're going to make a lot of mistakes. And so he predicted as early as 1960 that if we keep going down this path, we're going to end up with, we didn't have these terms then, we're going to end up with arms control deals with the Soviet Union that won't be very good. We'll give up ballistic missile defense, which we did under ABM, and we would embrace the idea of mutual assured destruction, which when Stan was first saying, this is where we're headed, people thought he was nuts, and that became doctrine by 1965, 1966. So what amazing foresight. Another issue that he saw way ahead of time was environmentalism, especially in its most popular form, the Malthusianism that came to characterize things like Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, the famous worldwide bestseller in 1969, Earth Day in 1970. As early as 1959, 1960, Stan was reviewing some obscure books saying, I see what's coming, a revival of Malthusianism, the idea that human beings are a liability, that population growth will necessarily doom the planet. And early on, he talked about why these claims were factually wrong, but also he thought what this really represents is not so much a factual or even a theoretical understanding, but there's a moral impulse behind that. And I think you can see that today. I know John Tierney a little bit, who used to be at the New York Times, and the most hate mail he ever got at the Times, he was a contrarian like Stan. Stan approved of John. The most hate mail he ever got was a New York Times Magazine article he wrote about why recycling is counterproductive. And the thousands and thousands of angry letters the Times got, none of them disputed the facts he laid out on the inefficiencies and resource wastefulness of many forms of recycling, not all. None of them disputed the facts. It was all, how can you be such a horrible human being to be against recycling? Recycling's next to godliness. If you're a New York Times reader, because most Times readers don't have many other sources of godliness, I'll just say, just put that out there. He also anticipated, I don't know what he would have thought of Donald Trump, and I hesitate to speculate, because Stan, if you knew him, was such a courtly gentleman. He did appreciate manners. So you can easily see him cringing, as many people did, of course, of Trump's behavior and his tweets and so forth. But Stan did anticipate and even advocate for certain aspects of what we today call Trumpism, certain populism, a certain emphasis on the plight of the working class. He used to say, in those days, we talked about the hard hats. That was the phrase that was used in the 60s and early 70s, but it meant the same thing as the voters that Trump appealed to in many ways. And so he wrote a lot about how conservative candidates and Republicans in partisan terms could appeal better to the working class. He did caution, though, against what might be called low-budget liberalism. You know, today there's a lot of enthusiasm among the new thing on the block, if you follow this, is national conservatism. And he, and one of the ideas of the so-called national conservatives is we need industrial policy to revive Ohio and Indiana. Not so much Alabama, interestingly enough. We could talk about that for a while. So, you know, industrial policy, I've been joking for a while because I'm old enough to remember Walter Mondale running for president, was an old New Deal liberal on industrial policy. And conservatives and Ronald Reagan uniformly denounced this as government planning and subsidies, and this is a terrible idea. So I asked my national conservative friends, so let me get this straight. Walter Mondale, who, by the way, in person was a wonderful guy. Anyhow, people love him who know him. Even Republicans in Minnesota loved him personally. He could run now as a Republican. Are we all Walter Mondale now? And Stan early on said, we don't want to do that. I'll just read one little passage from a speech he gave around 1978. Let's see, I don't want to read the whole thing. Just the last part of it. I think this, meaning the idea of having low-budget liberalism, I call it. He didn't use that phrase, but, you know, a sort of conservative welfare state, you might say, for the working class. He said, I think this is mistaken in terms of principle and in terms of practical politics as well. They, meaning the working class, should not be assailed with a pragmatic mishmash of Tory welfarism. The Tory party in England back to the 19th century was kind of for a welfare state. They should not be assailed with a pragmatic mishmash of Tory welfarism with law and order that blends insensibly into the very liberalism they are beginning to oppose. So I think that's what he'd say today is, I totally get the disposition about forgotten classes in America, but it's mistaken to just become low-budget liberals. Just two more things, and then I'll go to questions. He welcomed, but was wary of the arrival of the so-called neoconservatives in the 1970s. And a little background for students who may not know what this is all about, because it's changed over the years. I like to say there's three ways of neoconservatism. Neoconservatism 1.0 in the 60s were liberals who were mostly social scientists, so they did a lot of regression analysis and ran a lot of numbers. And they were skeptical that the Great Society welfare state that was expanding under President Johnson was going to work, or that it might even be counterproductive. And Stan, by the way, as a columnist, was noting as early as 1965, 1966, some of these liberals, he'd say, isn't this interesting? There's some liberals starting to be self-critical of their own team. Keep your eye on these people. In the 70s, most of them moved over to the right. Most of them became Republican supporters of Ronald Reagan. And wrote very excellent critiques of social policy. But their focus was domestic policy. By the late 80s, they said, by the way, liberalism is pretty bad on foreign policy, too. Fascinating stories about how Jimmy Carter's the next straw that tipped them into the Republican Party. People like Gene Kirkpatrick and Michael Novak. And Stan welcomed them. He said, definitely these are new allies that are useful and important. They have access to outlets that most conservatives like me don't have, like in the New York Times and other sort of centered in the Atlantic Monthly, baby. But he said, let's recognize they're coming over to us, not we're compromising with them. Because, by the way, a lot of those neoconservatives, they didn't object to the welfare state in principle, like most conservatives do. They just wanted to work better and didn't know how that could be done. And then neoconservatism 3.0 in the years under George W. Bush was associated with spreading democracy around the world, which Stan thought was a huge mistake. I think a lot of people have now come to that view by various avenues. And one of his late jokes, one of the jokes about neoconservatives was a neoconservative, well, there are two versions of it. One is a neoconservative is a liberal with a teenage daughter. That was one of them. The more common one was a neoconservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality. And so typical of Stan, his variation was a paleoconservative. That came along, the cavemen, right? A paleoconservative is a conservative who has been mugged by a neoconservative. And I can tell you that in conservative intellectual circles, that's a very popular joke these days, even though he gave it a long time ago. He liked to say, Irving Kristol is great, Bill Kristol's dad. Was one of the leaders of the neoconservative movement in the 70s and 80s. Irving Kristol's great, but Milton Friedman is greater. That was Stan's final default position on the matter. And then lastly, I've just hinted at it a bit. So I think I mentioned that the old right was pretty isolationist. That was part of the core of, and also the problem with the America First movement in 1939, 1940. And they attracted a lot of critics, rightly so, for certain aspects of their public face. But beyond that was the view that, we're the greatest, we're the biggest island nation with the biggest moat in the universe. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And so why do we want to get involved in these fights around the world? Well, you can play out that argument for a long time, and it's a worthy argument. But as I say, World War II, and then the Cold War afterward was a huge challenge for the old right. And so there's the question of prudence from the point of view of the statesman. Is the defense of the United States, does it really begin at the Atlantic seaboard, or maybe is it better to make it begin at the Rhine River or further east? Serious question that we'll never quite sort out. We're going through it right now, again, with the Ukraine crisis, which you can all see every day, every moment, right now. One of the things that was interesting about reading Stan's very careful commentary on the Vietnam War disaster as that unfolded so slowly and agonizingly in the 1960s, in which today just about everybody thinks was a blunder, or worse than a blunder. And what you could see was, he'd say, I think we're making incremental mistakes here. We seem to become path dependent on the view that, well, let's put in a few troops, and if that doesn't work, we'll just send in more, which is what happened. And now, he never wanted to give aid and comfort to, and again, you kind of had to be alive at the time. I was a kid, but I'm paying attention. The viciousness of the anti-war movement, the anti-Americanness of the anti-war movement. It wasn't just people saying this was this dumb, imprudent war to do. You had a lot of vocal people on the left saying they wanted North Vietnam to win. America with a K. That's kind of come back in recent years, right, on other grounds. And Stan didn't want to give any aid and comfort to that point of view. But embedded in his work was, this is the kind of thing I've been trying to warn about our foreign policy establishment, our foreign policy elites being prone to groupthink, to having defective conceptual ideas, having superficial ideas about things, and thinking in American force. That's our ace card to play always. And so when it came after 9/11, he said, by then he had quit writing his column. He was working on his 2 last books on different subjects, but he did in a couple of interviews say, this is like December of 2001, so it's just 3 months after 9/11, and he said to an interviewer, I think the George W. Bush administration has responded correctly in a lot of its moves to try and keep us safe, and of course in invading Afghanistan to root out al-Qaeda. He says, but I think this idea people are talking about of spreading democracy around the world is a crazy idea. That's something you associate with the old idealism of Woodrow Wilson, and that's not going to work very well. So I never found him saying anything about the Iraq War as it started to grind on and depress all of us, but you can see there a return to an older restraint, I'll put it that way. He was never an isolationist, and he always said, we're not going back to Bob Taft, or shouldn't go back to Bob Taft, and I think that's where we are today, and he was looking farther ahead than just about anybody, which I think informed his journalism and an awful lot of other things. And so I will wind up here and take questions. And how are we going to do this, Robin? Are you good? Have you got some that you can read to me, or how do you want to do this? Yeah, a good idea, yes. Also, they're taping it, right?
So you mentioned Ukraine just now, and I saw a question come in. So Arthur, where are you? So Arthur, one of the wonderful things about Troy is that we are blessed with a host of international students.
Oh.
So Arthur is from Iran, and so he's just with us for a semester, right? Am I remembering? Yeah. So he asked if, and this is going to have you forecast or kind of project, but if Mr. Evans were alive, what strategy would he suggest to the U.S. government regarding Ukraine?
Regarding Ukraine. Oh, okay. I thought you were going to mix Iran into that too, which I can do if you want. But
no, that was just in his introduction.
Yeah, I think he would be in favor of arming the Ukrainians with everything they needed to defend themselves. And I think, you never know for sure, and I think he would be in favor of, well, one of the things he'd say is, there's been this debate about whether Poland should supply old Soviet jets to Ukraine, and President Biden and others said that's a bad idea, that risks a war. Stan would have said, wait a minute, there's a precedent here. In the Vietnam War, the fact that we were a nuclear power and North Vietnam was not, that didn't stop the Soviet Union from giving advanced MiG fighter jets to the North Vietnamese to use against our planes and our troops. Why should it restrain us now? I think that's one answer he gives. So he'd be for vigorously arming them. I think he'd be for our using our defense our intelligence and other capabilities to get in the way and interfere with Russian operations, which I suspect we are probably doing, but who knows? We won't know for years. I think he would be very wary of going beyond all that. And that's probably a blend of my opinion and the way he thought about things. I can't do much better than that. About it, I'll just say a thing about Iran, since you're from there. there's no doubt in my mind that Stan would have disliked the original and the presumed revival of the nuclear development agreement with Iran that Obama brought us and now Biden's trying to bring back. What's that? Oh, yeah, absolutely, it's a mistake. But I do think, and here I'll connect the two. Here's where I think we're making a bit of a mistake on the Ukraine business. So we're now at, the phrase cancel culture. We're extending cancel culture to all things Russian. So orchestras are not playing Tchaikovsky. Russian artists are being banned and shunned. And something similar with Iran. So I like to teach the students, and if you've never read it, go read one of the famous Cold War documents called NSC, National Security Council, NSC 68, written I think around 1949. By Paul Nitze, who was around at the end, still negotiating on arms issues for Ronald Reagan. Under Harry Truman to Ronald Reagan, same person, very interesting guy. And Nitze says in there, one of the things we want to be careful about with the Soviet Union is to tell the people that it's your government we don't like. It's not you, the Russian people. You live in subjugation. We are all for you. And that should be a conscious message that the United States and its allies put out. We don't want to be anti-Russian. We don't want to be against the people. And keep the focus on what is wrong with their government. We ought to be saying that about Iran, and we ought to be saying that about Russia today. And we should meet. And now the question of sanctions, that's where Stan's views would be a little tricky, because he was pretty much a free trader. And we'll see. This is a huge subject, so I'm not going to try and say too much about it, because it very quickly gets into my analysis and not what Stan's would be. But he would be carefully weighing the sanctions regime and thinking about what works, what doesn't. Absolutely, he would have been against the Nord Stream pipeline and the energy dependency that's led us into this current impasse in certain ways. That's a big problem. He was always against, well, there was the pipeline issue in the 80s. There's a real echo of this. There was the first gas pipeline from the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan tried to stop in 1982. He didn't succeed, although he delayed it for at least a year and a half, and that had consequences. Anyway.
Oh, I like this one. This will allow you to kind of share a little bit about Stan and his personality. Jenny asked, what is your favorite memory with Stan? That's appropriate to share on a live stream.
No, I don't have any. No. There are two. One was meeting him for the first time. I knew who he was. I've been reading him for years as a college student. I was kind of a nerd. And I was, he's a famous person and this, big deal in the journalism world, and now I'm going to go be an intern for him. And meeting him for the first time, the first thing that struck me was how friendly and casual he was. He wasn't scary at all. I mean, I always kind of held him in awe, but it was how approachable he was. So right away, he put you at ease, and you became his best friend in about 15 seconds. It was fantastic, and much reassuring to a nervous kid right out of college, I have to say. I'm from California. I was all the way across the country, first time living on my own, really. Yeah, that's right. I mean, college doesn't really count as living on your own because you're okay. And then the second one was a good piece of advice he gave me. I forget, we were out after work someplace in the bar drinking, just two or three of us, and I'm peppering him with questions. Because, you always want, FaceTime with the boss is the modern cliche. And I'm peppering a whole lot of questions. I don't know that I was annoying him. I think you actually couldn't really annoy Stan because he loved young people. But I think what he observed in me was I'm the kind of person who, because I'm sort of high energy, Stan was a steady energy guy, is that I'm the kind of person who ran the risk of not turning it off. Remember I was saying earlier, you want to stick to your principles and not get sucked into the political vortex 100%. The variation here was, he said to me, you really should get into the habit of just turning everything off at 6 o'clock and having fun with your friends. And that sunk in with me, and it's advice I now try to pass on to students and everybody. Yeah, it's fun to sit in the bar, and Stan had a share of that. As a young man, he got in a few bar fights defending Barry Goldwater, reportedly. You can see this, but he mellowed as he got older. I'm kind of the same way, but that's very good advice. It's fine if you want to have the dorm hallway debate. Those are good. I had them in college. I'm not sure they're happening as much as they used to. I think they're good. They usually end up shouting, and that's fine. You're out at a bar and you want to argue about something, that's fine too. But you don't want that to be your normal mode of life at the end of the day. That was very good advice. That one really stuck with me.
Mark has asked, and then I'll add a little to it, or kind of refine it. Which of all of Stan's books do you personally like the most, and why? And I would say, which one, if they're going to pick one and read one first, which one would you suggest?
I think it depends on your interest a bit. So the two books of his that will stand the test, a lot of his books were, related to current issues. You can still read them, I think, with profit if you have the time for picking up his methodology, but they're dated in terms of issues. But The Theme is Freedom is a theoretical statement that will have a long shelf life because it's not issue-dependent or time-dependent. And I think it's a real neglected classic. It got good reviews when it came out, but I mean, that's one of those that you could still, if I could assign it as a textbook for students if I was teaching the class on the founding. I'll say one little more thing about that in a moment. And then, of course, his book on McCarthy, if you're interested in history, especially Cold War history, I think is also a classic that will stand the test of time as something that really goes into great detail. I'd love to tell stories about his research for it, but that would take too long. But The Theme is Freedom. I mentioned before, and I didn't develop the second half, which is that he filled in gaps. One of the great things about Stan is he actually picks, I won't say fights, but he disagrees in the book with certain prominent interpretations of the founding held by conservatives and liberals, but without ever naming names or picking a fight. There's no snark in it. It's implied if you read it very, very carefully, but he was a gentleman in his writing about these controversies. But one thread that he thought everybody had given insufficient attention to was the importance of the Bible in the evolution of human liberty, which happened slowly, which is why it sort of never came into sharp focus. I could go on for 20 minutes about this, and so I won't. And that, he thought, read directly to the English common law, which also has been kind of lost. I mean, in law school you'll hear about it, but people don't study it very closely. And he thought the Bible and the common law tradition in England, they belong together and are much more important than people think to the structure of our liberty. And by forgetting those roots, it leads to a lot of our modern confusions. He was, by the way, another area where he was economically literate, obviously. He really understood constitutional law at great depth. And I was amazed to sort of read here and there. He'd pick up on obscure cases that are really hard to describe. And read very challenging books and grasp the essence of them and be able to restate the central point in one or two sentences. So.
And then I'll use this as the last question for you before we switch over to the panel discussion. Claudia asked, because our current students never met Stan.
Right.
So what do you think Stan would say to encourage Hall School students when it comes to remaining ethical in today's society?
Oh, yeah. So, I often think that Stan's wit would have been perfect for Twitter, but he was not much for the internet. He never used email. He never used a computer. He did everything on a typewriter. And he used to like to say, if someone told him, an intern or something, that, oh, my computer ate my file, Stan would point to his typewriter and say, well, my computer never eats my copy. And about email, he would get email addresses assigned to him for organizations that he was part of, but he never used it. And people would say, wait, I've been sending him all these emails. Where are they going? And he joked once about, I think he credited Senator Sessions. He said, I did sign up for a special program of assisted email for the elderly. So, but that gets to the serious point, which is, and he did actually say this in reflecting on journalism late in life. He'd say, the internet's making it too easy. He didn't say to be lazy necessarily, or even to cut corners, but we all know the problem. We're overwhelmed with access to things on the internet. And so he'd say, to restate the way he put it, you need to be very discerning about the information you have. There's a basic tenet of journalism which doesn't originate with Stan, but you've all heard it, I hope, which is, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. That was, and he used to repeat that phrase, right? And so, he would say, anything you see on the internet, you want to try and check it out and verify it. Get a second source, another standard practice, right? A big problem in social science we hear about is confirmation bias. You'll see something and, say, that's what I think, that's what I agree with, and then you run with it without looking further to see whether it's well-founded, whether it's wrong, whether it's correct. If it's correct, you're really onto something. Just give two examples. I saw a tweet yesterday. I'm not going to mention the story, but a tweet yesterday is rocketing around the last 24 hours about something going on out in California that I know a little bit about, but I'm not sure it's true. And I've been sending emails saying, do you know if this story is true? Because the person who put it out on Twitter has a lot of followers, but it's not well known. So you don't want to, and of course in this instantaneous news cycle we have, the temptation to run with something is overpowering and you have to resist that. I'll tell you a story I broke, small story, but I'm in academia. I like to say I'm an inmate at UC Berkeley. That's a long, funny story. But I ran across this article. It was an academic journal article in education. What was I'm now blanking on the subject. And I read through the whole study, written in social science jargon, and I thought, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. I spotted some things that made no sense, and that were, a couple of organizations were listed in this article that don't exist. Because I knew the organizations that did exist. I said, what's this organization doing here? It's about conservative philanthropy. That's what it's about. There are these organizations that do this and this, and we've surveyed faculty, and they report this. And I know enough about statistics to know that the response rate claim was implausibly high. There's organizations that don't exist. Nobody fact-checked this article. It is printed in a prominent academic journal. So I went public saying, I found another hoax article. Sure enough, the article did turn out to be a hoax. And the journal had to retract the piece. The Chronicle of Higher Education called me up, did a story about it, because I said, this is a hoax. This story. How did this get published? It was peer-reviewed. Don't get me started on peer review. Stan could have made great fun of peer review, but that goes on. Once in a while you'll spot something like that, and then you've got something. And anyway, but thank you, Robin. Thank you all very much. This has been a great honor to be here.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And again, as you leave today, be sure to pick up the copy of Steve's book, and he's going to be available to sign it for you. And these were made available to us through our partnership with the Sorrell College of Business. So be sure to thank Dean Edwards as well as you're on your way out. Okay, panelists, I'm going to have you guys go ahead and make your way to the table, the stage. While they're getting settled, let me tell you a little bit about this fantastic panel today. Some faces you may recognize from being around the Hall School, others you may not, so let's introduce them. First up, we've got Andy Alabastro. He's a communications strategist who served as a speechwriter for the chairman of the Republican Party and the Bush administration. He is a counselor to CEOs at multiple Fortune 10 companies and has nearly a decade as a communications leader at United Technologies, which is now Raytheon Tech. Today, he leads the coalition relations team at the Heritage Foundation, the nation's most widely supported think tank, where he builds networks to advance public policy solutions that enable human flourishing. So the thing that you're going to enjoy most about learning about Andy is that he has a bachelor's degree in print journalism and political science from Troy University. And go Trojans, because he also was a quarterback for the Trojans, so while he was here. And then even better for this crowd, he was editor-in-chief of the Metropolitan. So welcome Andy back. Next to Andy is John. Oh, Darlene might get you. Next to Andy is John Merlin, also with Heritage Foundation. He's a communications expert in both journalism and corporate communication, and John actually spoke to some of our students yesterday during classes, and so thanks for that, John. He's currently the senior writer of donor communications for the Heritage Foundation.
He served as deputy editor for Investors Business Daily at America Online. You guys may not remember AOL. The front row will remember AOL. For AOL, he actually launched the AOL News opinion section. He was an editorial writer and an editorial board member for USA Today. His commentary pieces have been published in the Washington Post, Detroit News, National Review, and Forbes, and he's garnered many awards for his work, including being named one of the best politics and culture reporters in Washington by Forbes Media Guide. So, welcome, John. Everybody gets applause. Don't hold back. Next to John is Darlene Hutchison-Bale, and she graduated from Troy University with a bachelor's degree in print journalism. She spent 20 years as the editor of various print magazines and online publications, including 8 years in the law enforcement field and nearly 6 years as the communications and media director of the Dallas Bar Association. So, after more than 20 years of volunteer experience where she was working with crime victims, she was appointed by President Trump as the director of the Office for Victims of Crimes within the U.S. Within the U.S. Department of Justice, and she was responsible for the administration of more than $9 billion in grants and other projects. During her time at Troy, she spent 3 years on staff at the Metropolitan newspaper, serving as editor during her senior year. And she was an active member of Chi Omega. She's a lifetime member of the Troy Alumni Association, and in 2019 she was selected as Alumni of the Year for Troy University, and that's an honor presented to less than 1% of graduates of Troy University. So welcome, Darlene. And then a face you definitely recognize, Mr. Tom Davis on the end down there. He was a member of the Troy University class of 1981, worked at Troy University since 1998, first in university relations, and then for the last 8 years as executive assistant to the chancellor. He's a native of Langdale, Alabama. He spent 16 years in journalism following his graduation from Troy, and some of those establishments, media outlets, are the Eufaula Tribune, the Bainbridge Post Searchlight. He was also a reporter for the Southern Star and Ozark and the Montgomery Advertiser. He's received awards for his news writing, editorial writing, page design, and photography. He also served as editor of the National Journalism Center, a nonprofit foundation in Washington, which Stan founded. And so Tom is with us, also a Hall School grad. So we've got 3 Hall School grads on the panel for you today. And then Steve, if you feel called to answer any questions, then jump back up. We welcome you back up here. If you want to take a breather, that's fine too. So you guys start tweeting your questions in. I'm going to get started with one that was tweeted. Give me just a second to get back to that. Okay, so as the questions start to come in, this was actually directed at Steve, but I'm going to start with you guys on this. What's the most important lesson that you learned from Stan?
Hello, is this on?
That one's not on yet, I don't think. So just, oh, it is?
Testing.
There you go.
Well, Steve actually mentioned a lot of the things that I learned from Stan. I had the privilege of working for Stan for almost 6 years after I interned at the National Journalism Center. He published a magazine called Consumers Research, which was sort of the free market answer to the, you know, Ralph Nader, the sort of Naderite consumer groups who are always advocating for more government regulation and government control of the economy. And the magazine had a long pedigree. Stan ended up as the publisher, and I ended up as the editor of the magazine. So for all that time, I got a lot of direction from Stan, and gained even more respect for him as a journalist. And what Steve said was absolutely right. The things that Stan emphasized were getting the facts, going to original sources, not taking the word of, there are a lot of advocacy groups in Washington, there are a lot of think tanks in Washington, and they'll tell you what they think is going on or what they want you to think is going on, and Stan would say, don't go to those groups, so if you're writing about the federal budget, get a copy of the federal budget. And so That's what I did. I learned how to read the federal budget, which is a massive document. And in doing that, was able to report things that weren't being covered by other reporters because they were all taking their guidance from people who were advocating certain things. So if you wanted to know if spending was going up, look at the budget and find out, is spending going up? If you wanted to find out if spending had been cut, which was the argument in the 80s that the Reagan administration had drastically cut spending, and you looked at the numbers, it was completely false. Spending continued to increase, both in real terms, just in the number, and as a share of the economy. And so I was able to write a lot of good original stories only because I bothered to go to the original source. The other thing that Steve pointed out that struck me too was that Stan would always wanted you to keep asking questions and keep your sensibility about you. So stick to things, stick to sort of basics. So for one good example was, this is in the 80s. I'm not sure it's a big issue or people don't talk about it much now. But at the time there was all this concern about surplus grain and surplus commodities. There were warehouses full of this stuff. There were government warehouses full of cheese and various other things. And it was always treated like some mystery. Why do we have so much surplus crops? Why are farmers growing so much more than people need? Why do we have all this? And Stan's view was, well, look for a government program, look for a government policy behind it. And as it turns out, the farm programs basically paid farmers not to farm, or they paid them the same amount no matter how much they grew. So farmers had every incentive to overproduce because they knew if they planted fence row to fence row and they grew a ton of whatever corn or wheat or whatever, they'd get paid the same. And so they'd taken the market pricing out of the picture and created this distortion. And so those are the things that throughout my career since I have always done and practiced, and as if you want to be a journalist, that's what I think you should do, and just those few lessons have served me tremendously well throughout my career. So.
Does this work? I was fortunate to be in Mr. Evans' first class at Troy State in 1980, the fall of 1980, as a 2-year-old prodigy. I was going, but his first class, he said, the opening of the journalism seminar, and it's well worth for every journalism student to hear it. He said, he boiled it down to its essence. He said, you're hanging out a shingle that says, I know things, come to me for information, watch my TV program, watch my channel, buy my newspaper, listen to my radio broadcast, buy my magazine, whatever it is. I have things you want to know. And if you're going to make that claim, you've got to go find out things, as John said, that people want to know, and not pander to them, but you've got to. And so he said the essence is discovering information through good reporting, through good interviewing, through everything you're learning at the Hall School and everything we were learning then. And then the other thing he said that was incredibly important was that having a great writing style and he said it's important and it's served a lot of people well, but it should be secondary in your journalism education to learning how to find information, learning how to find the facts. And so those were the pillars that he introduced to us in the very first day he was here. And being reminded of that and remember that has served, as John said, served me well for a while, some 50 years, I guess, 40 years. Darlene, you want to say anything?
Sure. Back in the day, we were on a quarter system here at Troy, and so I believe it was the winter quarter that Stan would teach, and y'all wonder probably about the logistics of how he did this, and y'all correct me if I'm wrong, but this is my recollection from many years ago. He would teach a class, I believe, like on a Tuesday afternoon and a Wednesday morning. He'd fly in from D.C. on Tuesday morning, stay overnight, and then fly out Wednesday evening or something like that. So and winter quarter was the shortest, so for about 11 weeks he would do that every week, fly in and out. So he still had his Washington, am I right? Boy, I don't get many things right at this point. But so that's logistically how he was able to still be involved, and he was in D.C. at that time. And I heard so much about him. I didn't start out as a journalism major. I'm a math geek. Math is what I've always done best, so I came here thinking I was going to do math and physics. And then I ended up in the journalism department because one of my sorority sisters told me I needed more campus activities, and she drugged me over there, and I found my home, obviously. And that analytical brain transferred over, obviously, to researching and reporting, and so I really did find my niche. And we heard a lot about Stan when you were an underclassman. I think I changed my major probably late in my sophomore year. I was starting at the Metropolitan early sophomore year and did 3 years there. And it sounds like I did time, but anyway. But it was, you always heard about Stan, and he seemed intimidating, but like Stephen would say, once you got to know him, he was everything but. He was just very encouraging, and that was so wonderful to have. And I've gotten to know a lot of your professors, and I know you have that, where they hold you to a high standard, but yet are encouraging along the way and give you. And so I really encourage you to take advantage of that. Get to know your professors. Volunteer at the things on campus, with the Metropolitan, with the TV station. I know so many opportunities, or volunteering in the community. That's where you really learn stuff like these gentlemen are talking about. And I know Stan would endorse that wholeheartely, that you've got to get involved in your community and know how it functions and what's going on. But I always heard that, you won't get an A in Stan's class. He's tough. I mean, you can get a B. B's he gives out, but A's, he doesn't give A's. And I kind of went in there going, I guess I can handle a B. Well, I took 2 of his classes and got A's in both, and I was not typically an A student. I didn't admit that out loud, did I? Anyway, but Stan was the type that he made you want to work hard for it and earn it. And I remember telling him what my seminar project was going to be on, and he looked at me, and we would write it down. He was walking around the classroom, and especially women in the 80s, he said, wow, you don't mind breaking glass ceilings, because it was a pretty ambitious topic. And I pretty sure I knocked it out of the ballpark, because I uncovered everything I could and did all kinds of research. It spent a lot of time doing microfilm and microfiche, and that's your assignment today, to find out what that is. In the library, we didn't have Google, so but Stan just inspired us. He wanted you to work hard, and especially early in your career when you're learning those trades, and dig stuff up and just explore.
Yeah, I would just echo 1 or 2 key themes, and I think try to connect it to you all as majority students in the room. Good journalism is earning the public trust and being able to hold yourself in high esteem in the work that you do. And we talked about this last night with the Hall School professors, and I think what an aspiration, right? And Stan did that very well, and he did it so well that even though he was an opinion journalist and pursued ideas in addition to good journalism, he was the editor of a major metropolitan daily newspaper at the age of 26, right? That's not far from where you guys all are right now. So if you do journalism well, if you want to earn the public trust, the arc of your career is really whatever you want it to be. And if you think about that, he was also in a very competitive marketplace at the time, which is different today, right? You've got all these different channels and platforms that you can communicate on. You learn about those things. You're better at it than all of us up here on stage, except for maybe Tom, right? But you're on these platforms communicating in a way that's going to iterate and innovate, in 2 months, in 2 years, that gives you an opportunity that somebody like Stan didn't have. So whereas he had a channel that met a lot of people in a very traditional sense, you have this opportunity. So you've got to hold yourself to the highest standard. That's why when you get into questions of journalism and ethics, what is truth, right? Is there one truth, or are there different versions of the truth? And I think those are the great questions when you're in college to ask yourself, ask your professors, and understand that, if there's one truth, but there's different experiences in that environment, in pursuit of that, right, you can unlock a lot of good thinking, you can unlock a lot of good questions that you would ask people, and then you're able to communicate that back. Z and I had a great conversation about freedom of speech and how important that is. I would never suggest that she and I agree on every political issue or on every issue, what it means to be human today and all that, but we should both have the opportunity to have this high standard of what freedom of speech is, that we have the opportunity to have that discussion and dialogue, then try to persuade each other and engage all of you in that conversation. But journalism is is an amazing thing, and we live in an environment in a country where you can pursue that. I mean, what an opportunity, right? And what Stan taught me was that opportunity was at my fingertips if I wanted to pursue that, just like my colleagues here. So I mean, it's an awesome opportunity in the way that Hall School of Journalism operates. You guys have this opportunity to press your professors on that, and then teach us, the way in which we can iterate on different technology going forward to continue that conversation.
Andy, that's really important, and I can't leave this topic because when Mr. Evans came here, Troy University was a vastly different place than it is today. We probably had 70% of our students were first-generation college students. We were 10 years on the other side of being a university. We were 25 years on the other side of offering an academic discipline other than teaching teachers. So when he first came here, we were in the embryonic stages of being a real university. And one person said he was making these, and I had to piggyback on what Andy said because this is very important. One of a smart aleck student in his first class, and it wasn't me, when Stan was talking about aspirations in doing great things, somebody said, yeah, that's easy for you to say. You went to Yale University. And he stopped, and he never got angry. I worked for him for 3 years in D.C. I knew him, saw him every year until his death. I never saw him get angry except one time he stepped out from around on the third floor of Wallace Hall, one of those classrooms up there. He said, let me tell you one thing right now. He said, let's get this straight before we go one other step. You can go anywhere you want to go in the world from Troy State University. You can go to the White House. You can go to the New York Times. You can go anywhere you want to go. And he said, I never want to hear that kind of talk again. And that was the most encouraging thing I heard in my undergraduate years at Troy. Sorry, I meant to say that up front, had to say it.
No, we're glad you said it, yeah. I'm going to combine a few questions into one. They're similarly themed, so we're going to talk about the F word, fake. Thanks, Steve, for laughing. So with the climate that we are in right now as journalists, it can be a very hostile place. We're teaching our students to be ethical, how to be trustworthy, how to dig for the truth. But they're even finding that going on stories here at the university, people aren't trusting of them and what's going to run in the Trop or be on Trojan Vision. What advice as kind of veteran journalists would you give to them to stick it out in this world of a little bit of hostility due to the assumption of fake news?
If you want to work in fake news, the New York Times and CNN are always hiring.
Well, I mean, it gets back to if you do your job and you do it well, and people learn to trust you with the facts and the information, as Tom pointed out, you're putting yourself out there as somebody who is trustworthy and can be relied on to provide accurate information. If you do that consistently, people will start to gravitate towards you because they see that you're not going to let them down. Whereas what's happened with the New York Times and CNN and so many other news outlets is they so often let their readers down because they are so driven by ideology and advocacy that they don't bother to report facts. They just, if something sounds good, it must be true, so let's run with it. And you saw that more often than I've ever experienced during the Trump administration, where reporters were repeatedly having to retract stories that they put out because they didn't really bother to check the facts before they ran with them, because they made Trump look bad, okay? And so the credibility of journalism has gone way down. We work with in my journalistic capacity with a polling firm that tracks trustworthiness of how much trust people put in journalism, and it's just steadily declining. And it's very it's worrisome, frankly. It's worrisome because the fact that where are people supposed to go for information if they can't trust journalists? But what's even more worrisome is that journalists don't seem to care. They don't seem to be bothered by the fact that they're perceived as untrustworthy advocates who are just pushing an agenda and not reporting the facts. The other thing I would say about fake news and the fear factor is that was one thing Stan was, I thought, really remarkable about, is that he was I was reminded of this when he talked about the McCarthy book, that Stan was completely fearless when it came to, if the facts were there, he was going to say it, and he wasn't going to be shy about it. He wasn't going to try to shade it or pretend like it wasn't true because that's what everybody was saying. He would always go with the facts. And with McCarthy, for example, he got criticized. He was accused by National Review, which is a prominent conservative magazine. The review of his book on McCarthy in National Review accused him of plagiarism, among other things. And Stan wrote an uncharacteristically furious reply to National Review as a result of that. But he had to know that he was going to be attacked like that because he was taking on pretty much everybody when he was, why would you bother defending this guy? Everybody knows he's evil. Everybody knows McCarthy's terrible. And yet he was willing to dig into the facts and report the facts as they were and not as he wanted them to be. So I just think that combination, stick to the facts, report the truth, and don't worry about whether people are mad. Because, I always feel like if you're a good journalist, you don't have any friends. And so if you are telling the truth consistently, you're going to upset a lot of people.
To add to what these two gentlemen have said, if you do your research and you're digging and you're asking all the right questions and don't just go with what you've heard and the surface information, that's where you can separate yourself from those journalists out there. And I have a hard time calling them journalists, but the folks that have this agenda, as John's talking about too, that so often are just they shouldn't even be in this business, in my opinion. But and if that's the way you want to operate, go find something else to do. I still believe in ethics, and I love this the slogan that the Hall School of Journalism has adopted, and wish it would just go viral and go national, international, and all. And I just wish that there was something we could come back to, because all of us up here haven't seen a few decades of this erosion. It's just been very disheartening for me, and I'm sure for my colleagues here too. And I love the story that Stephen told about Senator Kennedy and who to ask questions of. Sometimes you have to go a little further than who seems like the obvious person. Let's go get a quote from Senator Kennedy. Well, maybe that's the easy and lazy thing to do, but when you find somebody who's really is a good source for that information, and where I really see that this has happened, and I'm so sad about it, is some of the local markets, smaller papers, smaller, even like a Montgomery, it's the capital, but local news has a lot of challenges, whether it's the daily paper or the TV stations. And so sometimes they're just giving you, I don't want to say superficial, but, and they have resources. It becomes a business model that we could talk about all day long, too, about, they have to have the advertising and that's, and the subscriptions and circulation. And that's a challenge. So they, not too many journalists want to work for free, even though, when I first got out of college, they told us you pretty much weren't going to make a whole lot more than that. But we had a dedication to it. So I think you can separate yourself and challenge yourself and challenge each other to hold yourself to a higher standard. And I'm optimistic we can still maybe turn this around.
Well, as I understand the original question, and I won't, if I'm off base, Robin, bring me back in. I don't mind. I don't have any ego about this. But one, people who have been journalists or reporters, the idea of fake news is not new. It's been around since the first newspapers were published, the first magazine since Gutenberg invented movable type. So the fake news is not a new idea, and people who work in the journalistic arena have to develop a thick skin, and that's one thing Stan Evans said. You have to be impervious to criticism, but defend yourself, as John said, when the facts are on your side. So that still holds true today. The second thing is that you may feel threatened by the hostile attitude toward journalists because of where you are in your career. And you all may be pretty good now, but if you stay with it, you're going to get a lot better. You're going to get a lot better, and you're going to get a lot more confident. You're going to, and so working in that arena, as intimidating as it might be, let me assure you will become less and less intimidating with each passing day in the business. And that's all I got to say about that.
He put a period on it, Stan.
Can I add just one more thing to that?
Yeah, sure.
So on the subject of hostility and fake news and how people respond to journalists, it just reminded me that one of the things I've learned is never underestimate the power of being polite with people. When I was at AOL News, people would email me in reaction to things that I wrote. And one letter, for example, began, "Dear moron," and then went on from there. Another said, "I hope you die in the next terrorist attack." And instead of like being angry, I responded, "Thank you for taking the time to write. I myself hope there isn't another terrorist attack." And what happened was a lot of these people wrote back. That person in particular said, "I'm really sorry. I shouldn't have said that. That was wrong of me." And on Twitter, which of course is a cesspool, there was one time where there was some sort of exchange with somebody on Twitter, and I said, "You're right." And the response was, "No one has ever said that on Twitter." And I do think that, because you're gonna ruffle feathers, but if you're positive about it and you're polite with people, that again, it's about, so fake news is people don't trust you because you peddle fake news, but if you're honest and trustworthy and you're a good person, then you're going to build that trust.
Taylor had a question, and I'm going to start by saying we talk about in class inverted pyramid style still. Last night, Andy and I were having a conversation about when the Trop used to have to cut and paste articles together and line it up. It's very different now, you guys. But before, you guys know, inverted pyramid style was because a copy editor could literally just cut off the bottom of your story. So you wanted to get the good stuff up top. Well, now we know we still have to write that way because people just don't read to the bottom. They're just stopping. So Taylor's question has a little to do with that. Conciseness is imperative in storytelling as a journalist. Taylor says she tends to word vomit, and she uses way too many words, and so she's looking for advice on being more concise while still being impactful.
Well, you've heard my answers. I'm no expert on being concise, but I'll take a crack at it, and I'll take a crack at it from the Book of Evans. And he said, become your own best editor. Become your own harshest critic. You write something, you go back and take a look at it and say, am I too wordy? Am I using the right words here? Is it everything in the right order? And you become your own harshest critic, and you don't look at your words as pearls not to be tampered with. you will go a long way to improving your writing, and the people you write for will really appreciate it. That's the best advice I can give.
Some of you may hear about like the elevator speech. If you're trying to convince somebody of something, or if you're trying to, you get in the elevator with the CEO of the company that you want to work for, or somebody who you know would be a hiring manager of the job you'd like to have, how to, you know, pitch yourself in those few seconds between that floor and that floor. And you shouldn't push the button to stop the elevator either. But to try to be concise and wrap it up. And I would put that also toward whatever story you're trying to tell, that if you have just a few seconds to tell somebody something, and I've always enjoyed the reporting more than the writing of this business, and digging for stuff and being able to relay the information, the important facts. If somebody asks you more and says, you know, well, tell me more about that. And that's the way you could think of your story is, you know, you give more facts as you go along, but to just, what would you need to know if you're in that elevator and you say, there's been a terrorist attack, have you heard about it? You know, and what those important elements would be and how it relates to that person.
A couple textbook things, and then a short commentary comment, but, you know, omit needless words, right? Kill your darlings. You might love language that you've written. We all do, but you've got to kill those darlings. And that's a sign of respect for your audience. You're communicating the essence of what needs to be communicated, not your personality or your take. As a journalist, obviously, when you get into opinion journalism or feature journalism, that can become very much a trait of your style and what differentiates you in the marketplace. And so you have to understand what you're trying to communicate, your role, the platform you're on, all of that you learn in classes and whatnot. And you know, in my bio, you know, I'm a quarterback, I'm a coach, I'm a communicator, and I'm a coalition builder. It's all about effective communication. We don't have time to use flowery language all the time. We need to be direct. We need to talk about what our destination is, what our goal is. Other people can make a determination if they're on board. But when you're communicating straight news and straight journalism, you want to communicate straight news and straight journalism.
Yeah, and that's a good point. You really just need to know who your audience is. So if your audience is, if you're reaching out to people who like to savor prose and drink coffee and read a long article, there are people like that, and it's okay to be expansive in that case. But most of the people who are going to be reading news stories are short attention span. They will read the first 2 sentences and then decide if they want to go on. If they get that far, they might, if you can get them to click on the headline, then that's a win. But getting them to read to the bottom of a story is, and you can actually, of course, you can track this. You can see how long, and it's very depressing. You can see how long somebody is stuck with an article, and you know, it's like 2 seconds is the average. Like, okay, we got a page view though. So yeah, it's about knowing your audience, and it's absolutely right, respecting your audience and their time, and so it may be fulfilling personally to be expansive, but you know, if it's frustrating the reader, then you're really not doing your job.
I want to add one quick thing, because a lot of you will be journalists and news reporters when you leave here. A lot of you may go into corporate communications or another field, and just like these gentlemen are saying, it depends who your audience is. If you're writing press releases for a company or for an association, that's one thing. Or, but your role will dictate how much you use. And some of those flowery words, I'm sure that we would cut as journalists in a news story, may be required in that environment. So, being aware of that and knowing who you're serving and what the objective is really the top of the to knowing and being successful.
Just add
Sure.
one quick comment, because I agree 100%, and then I was thinking about what I said. There's also a need for you all as students to sort of pressure test that as platforms change, right? If you think about the human race and human evolution, we communicated in pictures and drawings and things before we ever created an alphabet that became sort of popularized, and now we communicate in writing. So that over the full scope of human history, we communicate in pictures and art, and pictures worth 1,000 words. And so as you have platforms and multimedia that allows you to communicate in different ways, see it as creative conflict within how you communicate, as opposed to thinking I just have to say 4 words, like there was an attack, right? I mean, think about the pictures, the mood, the sentiment, and all of that. You're all very good at this. You study this with your professors, but that is the difference, I think, in terms of where the art of writing and writing well is also a little bit different than the art of communications. They obviously sync up when you're a journalist. You want to earn the public trust. Don't just show the one image that you think tells the story. Show the full image, those kind of things. But you have to think about that, the scope of how communications changes, and you're at the tip, the leading edge of a lot of that with where we are today with technology.
So our journalism students are required to do a 5-hour credit internship before they graduate. So this question has to do with that. And how many of you guys are either currently interning or heading into your internship in the summer? So they're going to really want to hear this answer. So Megan asked, this is a double-barreled question, you guys, but what's something that you want every college student entering their first internship to know, and what's the biggest takeaway from an internship you've had?
Doc, I've got to tell the story. So my internship was with WTBF Radio here in town. I was a print major, but thought that would diversify things for me, and I think I counted at one time, written about 200 pieces by the time my 3 years of at the Trop, and I'm really going to date myself here, but there was a chancellor Troy State University had for a very long time named Dr. Adams, and he was retiring, and they were going to pick a new guy. Could never fill this guy's shoes. I mean, who could? And I was assigned to go to the Board of Trustees meeting where, and I was working for WTBF Radio during my internship to see, and this is pretty cool. I mean, all the Board of Trustees for the university and vice presidents and all the statewide media at least, and they chose a fellow named Dr. Jack Hawkins. And nobody really...
Who's that guy?
Yeah, I mean... It's a daunting task to fill Dr. Adams' shoes, but, maybe he could do it. And so I run back over to the radio station to break the news, because back then we didn't have satellite trucks, and WSFA, they had to drive back to break it. I guess they could have made a phone call. We didn't have the internet. And so my takeaway from my internship was I broke the news that Jack Hawkins was going to be the next chancellor of Troy State University. And I didn't do live radio. I usually would take mine and they would stick it in the next morning. So I learned to do live radio that day. So I think sometimes living outside your comfort zone, and even though your knees are knocking because you're at this meeting with all these really impressive people, go and push the envelope and learn what you can there and ask all the right questions. And then we were asked to come back later that afternoon to do a conference call with them. And I don't know if I was included in that group or if I was supposed to come back. I'm just like this, new cub journalist here. But I was like, okay, when, where? And I, came and we all asked him questions over a speakerphone. But, that would all be Zoom, I think, now. But that's live outside your comfort zone. Push the envelope. Try to get those really cool internships. A lot of you didn't raise your hand, so I assume that you haven't, you're not at that stage yet, but apply for those. You hear about them, and don't sell yourself short that, great story that Tom told about Stan, that you can go anywhere with the education that you're getting here at Troy.
I want to say something about practical experience to directly, the part of the question was, the one thing you need to know to carry into an internship? Well, assuming that, and I think I'm on solid ground, assuming that your professors are teaching you things about writing and news gathering and PR, if you're on the PR track, or broadcasting, assuming you have that, the one thing that will separate you from a lot of people, and it's easy to do now in an internet age, is find out a little more than just cursory information about the organization you're going to intern with. If you're going to a local TV station, is it the heritage station? In other words, is it the one that's been the local ratings leader for 50 years? Who is their iconic local anchor person? If you're going to a newspaper, how long has the newspaper been there? Find out more than just, okay, I'm interning at the Montgomery Advertiser and it's at, I was about to say Washington Avenue, but they've moved there a long way. But find out more than just the name, the phone number, and the street address. And go in and act like you know a little bit about the culture of that will impress people because you took the time to find out about them. Everybody likes people who are interested in them because it's all about me.
It is always. The other thing I would just add is I've hired people and I've applied for jobs. And the hardest thing for a hiring manager, this is the next step after an internship, but when you're trying to get your first job, the hardest thing to do is to stand out in a stack of resumes. And so your internship is actually, in some ways, an extended job application. And it's the opportunity for an employer to see you at work, which they can't get from a piece of paper. And so if you're responsible, you show up on time, you do hard work, you work hard, you take direction, but you don't need your hand held, that sort of thing, then if you were to ever to apply for a job at that outlet, they're much more likely to consider you or hire you right out of your internship even. I mean, at the Heritage Foundation, Heritage has a very robust internship program that we bring in about 200 young students, mostly college graduates, not all, each year, and they live and work in Washington, D.C. for the Heritage Foundation. And they make, the internship is really an integral part of the Heritage Foundation. So the interns are given substantive work. And we recently, so as part of donor communications, we write to donors, and some of them pay to name an internship or name an intern after them and sponsor an intern. And so we were reporting to them, and I got the list of all the Heritage employees who had been interns, and there's like 45 of them. One is the vice president of donor relations, and it's because these interns are showing themselves to be smart, capable, hardworking, and that's the biggest hurdle for somebody who's trying to hire is, okay, they look good on paper, but will they show up? Will they do the work? Can they get along with people? So think of it as this is a unique opportunity for you to show yourself to a prospective employer, and it's very likely that you'll end up working there.
Yeah, I would simply add, the benefit of being at Troy and working at the Metropolitan or on Trojan TV, Trojan Vision, is that you've got all this hands-on experience that other candidates might not have. And if you believe that's the path you want to follow, I would just echo a little bit of what Darlene said about take a risk, take an opportunity. You might not want to be in D.C. for your entire professional life, but if an opportunity exists to intern somewhere like that, it would be a great learning experience. You would try something new. I mean, I interned I graduated from Troy and had, certainly Stan as a professor, but then I went to intern for him at the National Journalism Center. And in addition to the colleagues that you've heard from today, we had other people come through there. Bob Sciarrito is a reporter for the Associated Press, based out of Chicago. Terry Moran is at ABC, I believe, still. There was a guy in my class named Emmanuel Duparc who writes for AFP, the French wire service. I think he's based in either Pakistan or maybe in Ukraine right now. But I mean, these are in this case guys who didn't pursue any kind of opinion journalism or PR or anything like that. My first two jobs after my internship were in local news reporting, and to me it was fascinating. I mean, this is as close to home as you can get for people. The idea of how important a planning and zoning committee meeting is about whether or not that McDonald's is going to come in on that intersection and whether they're going to have a gigantic M that you can see from the highway or they're not going to allow it. I mean, this is how people live their lives and make these decisions in their communities, and you have a role to play in facilitating that conversation and talking to people and understanding that. So, I got bit by the bug of DC, and I when I fell in love with the ideas here at Troy as well with the political science part of my major, I knew that would be part of my career, but I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't gone to DC, tested it a little bit, did the local journalism, learned about that part of it, and kind of tethered that to different parts of my career going forward. But just to lastly echo what John was saying, and I think this is what you'll hear from anybody, but really have to internalize it. Bring the energy and enthusiasm. Let that manager or whoever's your boss at your internship direct you where they want you to go, where they want you to bring that energy and enthusiasm. But they hired you as an intern because you got the skill set. They want to test you out to see if they want to bring you on full time. So just go, 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 and enjoy it.
So Georgia is coming to us later than her freshman year. She was a political science major, and we tempted her to the dark side with cookies and good things. So her question is, and John, this may be a good one for you because, as you shared yesterday in the classes, you were a philosophy major that graduated with no journalism experience, really. So what advice do you have for someone getting into their journalism career late in their senior year?
I say there's absolutely no problem with that. I didn't get into journalism until after my senior year because I graduated with a philosophy degree. The only encounter I had with journalism in college was I got a job as the janitor for the student publications building where the Michigan Daily was published. So I would go sweep out the newsroom and mop the floors and clean the bathrooms. And when I applied for the National Journalism Center, the program Stan ran, I sort of feigned my interest in journalism, to be honest with you, because I really wanted to come to Washington. And it was at the Journalism Center that I realized how much I loved journalism and loved the way Stan taught it. But I didn't have a journalism background or experience other than, reading newspapers. And so, and I do think that I love the fact that you guys are journalism students, but remember too that you need to learn to be experts about things that you're going to be covering. And so, being a journalist isn't about learning how to write journalism. It's about how to write about issues and topics. So you need to know those things. And so if you're a history major, if you're a poli-sci major, if you're a computer scientist, you can be a good journalist. In some ways, a better journalist. So it's great that you're coming to this, but it's absolutely not a problem that you haven't been a journalism student.
We are almost out of time for our panel session, so I'm going to wrap this up. If you've had my classes, then I've shared that I have the same last question for everyone, and that is because people prepare. They get nervous, and they've thought about all the things they're going to say, and sometimes the last question, asking them, is there anything else you want to say? Is there anything that you want to tell me that I didn't ask you? That's where you get the good stuff sometimes. So, to the panelists, is there anything that you'd like to share with our students and our live stream audience at home that we didn't ask you today?
When I was here at Troy, one thing that Chancellor Hawkins said to us as a group of students was that college is like a buffet menu. There's all kinds of things that you can choose and try and learn and decide how you're going to pursue a course in life. And I learned so much from Chancellor Hawkins, a remarkable leader. I just have a great affinity for him and for Troy and for all the teachers and everybody here, including the Sorrell College of Business, which I did not go through. But we're really appreciative that they're sponsoring the symposium. But I would just say, that's the beauty of the Hall School of Journalism. You're able to get your hands in, learn what you like about journalism, take a few more classes, try different things. That's the beauty of college and the college experience. So the only thing I would want to leave you with is just remember that, Stan is a guy we're talking about because he was a remarkable person in our lives. You've got those people now here with you. I think he would be thrilled that we're talking about him. He would probably want a few more jokes, so we should have gotten to those. But he played a real important role in our lives. But you've got the professors and the people here now that are playing that role in your life. And so, that's the beauty of it. Embrace it. Ask those questions. Always raise your hand. I'd be thrilled to talk with every single person here. I'm not sure the time will allow that, but I'd be more than happy to. What can we do as Trojans to help you as the next generation? I'm just thrilled to be here. So that's the only thing I would want to leave you with is you've got a lot of people that care about your success. those of us up here, everybody else in the Troy family.
I would just say, don't take yourself too seriously. That was one of the things that I learned.
Is that directed at me?
Yes. Speaking as a fellow quarterback, no, I wasn't even an eighth back. But that was one of the things that I admire about Stan, is that even though he was extremely talented, knowledgeable, and very serious about he always called it the craft of journalism. He said it's not a profession, it's a craft, which I thought was interesting because it was a sign that first he had some humility about what he was doing, but he also, his personality, because he was he was often self-deprecating, and he just didn't take himself too seriously, and that's something that I've taken away from him, and try to get some perspective on the rest of the world as well, because the things that seem like monumental problems today, tomorrow will have been forgotten. And so what I've noticed in news especially is this idea that everything that happens today has some earth-shattering consequence to it. And then tomorrow it's like, what was that story again? And it's the next one. And it's like, learn history, learn to think of things in a greater context, and enjoy yourself.
I think one thing that's remarkable is that we are sitting up here first with Stephen Hayward and then the four of us recounting a really great professor. Stan clearly had a sphere of influence, but each of us does. Each of us, we do have that. I mean, you do, even though you may think of yours as being smaller, and my colleagues here obviously do. What you do with that is really important, and who you're able to influence, and we've talked about things like fake news and ethical journalism and acting ethically also if you find yourself in corporate communications where you might be educating your bosses. Some of these gentlemen maybe in their capacities have to bring their skill set to, when their bosses say, hey, let's do this, and they go, yeah, well, that may not, you do that in a respectful way to just educate them and say, because I know many times when I was working in different capacities, you sometimes had to pull them back into reality and say, well, that's not probably here's another idea of how we could accomplish this. And I found that so many of you may think you know what you want to do right now, and I loved my career in journalism. I spent most of my time in magazine publishing, which was really pretty ironic because they offered one magazine class when I was here, and I didn't take it because I thought, I'm not going to do magazines. I want to work for a big metro paper. I want to maybe go to Indiana like Stan did. I wanted to follow in his footsteps. But then I spent, and y'all can see the article I did about Stephanie and her office, Stephanie East and her office on the wall there. But in our magazine, but I think it's so important to just realize what your opportunities are, and then maximize that. And mentoring is one of my favorite subjects. If you can be on either end of that, and simultaneously, you can be mentoring the next generation, but yet identify those people that a lot of the professors here who can be your mentors, and don't be afraid to ask them to, it's not like asking them out on a date or anything, but just to know that you want to tap into that knowledge base that they have, and please don't let this book that you're going to pick up today sit on your shelf and don't crack the spine. Oh, I've got so many other your textbooks you got to read and everything. Open it up, pull out sections, even if you don't read it front to back right away, just but they should. But I think there's so many nuggets in there that you can pick up. I ordered mine and got it 2 days ago, and I've been able to pick around a little bit. But there's a lot of knowledge you can pick up that's in there, and other things that you've heard about with Stan, and let his sphere of influence go a little further.
I would just add, everybody on the panel, their closing comments have been excellent and on point. But I want to expand on one, and this is how I'll end up. I think Dean Edwards, who got a bit of mentoring from Stan Evans. I know Dr. Hayward, to a certain extent, Doc Kirby, and everybody on this panel, Robin, Aaron, everybody who was exposed to him. knew what an outstanding mentor he was to so many people. And that had to be incredibly time-consuming and an incredible burden that he bore gratefully. Some of you are going to be, right now, you may not think it, I hope you do, but you may not think it. You're going to be incredibly successful, remarkably successful, successful beyond anything you can even imagine right now when you do mentor people like Mr. Evans mentored us. Thank you.
Thanks to the students and our faculty. Dr. Diggs, I failed to introduce you earlier, but please raise your hand, and our interim director, Dr. Diggs, if you've not met her. And then Dean Edwards on the end over here. If you've not had a chance to chat with him, catch him and do so. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to Steve for coming and sharing your thoughts about journalism and your thoughts about Stan. Students, you are dismissed, but please do not forget to grab your copy. We're gonna move Mr. Hayward outside so that he can meet with you and sign that, and then our panelists will be around for a little bit longer if you had questions for them that we didn't get to.
Joe Duffy texted me a quick slap. Joe Duffy, a friend of ours. I think it's Joe. I don't have his. See if this is Joe's number.